Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Now, an update on wheat improvement advances here at Kansas State University. Researchers here at K-State say that their work to improve genes in wheat varieties using gene editing technology is another positive step toward global food security. K-State wheat geneticist Eduard Akhunov and his colleagues are working with this technology developed 5 years ago that can be used to modify any gene in a living organism with high precision. Their work with wheat is featured in the inaugural issue of the CRISPR Journal, which was released just a couple of weeks ago. The name of that journal refers to the technical nomenclature for the technology, and the specific version of it worked with at K-State the CRISPR-Cas9 technology. It was introduced in 2012, and Eduard calls it a simple yet a powerful tool for editing genomes.
It allows to create quickly genetic changes in the genome of wheat, and then you can create new varieties with the improved traits much faster than using traditional breeding approaches.
Eduard says to think of this CRISPR-Cas9 to be like molecular scissors that can make changes very precisely in a particular place of the genome. Using this tool, one can selectively modify any part of the genome to improve genes controlling major agronomic traits. He points out it's not unlike natural processes. It's just a matter of acceleration.
The same thing can happen by natural mutations over time, but you are just accelerating it by specifically modify one place. But if you would wait, for example, a couple of million years, or maybe screen thousands and thousands of wheat lines collected around the globe, you'll probably get the same effect. And then you'll get mutation in the same place that will have the same effect. But here you just do it within a year.
Again, Eduard says that the process of traditional breeding, screening existing germplasm collections for genetic variation, is useful, but is extremely time-consuming, and may fail if the specific genetic variation is not present in the screened germplasm. That's where this new gene editing technology comes in.
You just induce the variation in a specific place in the genome because you know that this part of the genome is important, and this change will create beneficial changes in the trait, and that's what it is. And we just do it much faster by accelerating natural process of mutation.
He talks more about how this process actually works.
The way we do it, because when you put CRISPR-Cas9, it becomes part of the wheat genome for a while, but that chromosome, we make a cross with the plants that do not carry CRISPR-Cas9, and then in the progeny of this cross, we just select only those plants that do not have CRISPR-Cas9, but carry the change in the genome that we wanted to induce.
Eduard and his research team are working with a suite of 25 genes controlling traits that have the potential to affect wheat yield. Using the CRISPR-Cas9 technology, they have the ability to improve each of these genes before testing them in the greenhouse and eventually evaluating them in field conditions.
The gene-edited plants, depending on which gene you modify, can have a whole suite of improved traits. It can be increased yield, it can be improved disease resistance, it can be improved nutritional qualities, and so on. It's just everything depends on which gene you choose to modify. And over recent years, we had a number of studies done in wheat, in barley, in rice, in maize, and many other crops where researchers identified genes that control important agronomic traits, including yield and disease resistance and so on. And what we do is we take these genes and using the available wheat genome sequence, we identify the analogs of these genes in wheat, and after that we design CRISPR-Cas9 experiments so that we can modify these genes in wheat and then test if this modification will improve the trait that we're working on or not. And we test that in the field or in greenhouse. And in this particular project that we are currently running, which is the USDA-funded project, we are trying to modify genes that control different yield component traits. And the yield component traits, these are seed size, number of seeds per spike, number of tillers, and these are the traits that contribute to increased yield. And we systematically go gene by gene and modify them using CRISPR-Cas9 system, and then we test if these changes in the wheat genome would result in increased yield.
Once they identify the genes that beneficially affect yield-related traits in wheat, they work with the wheat breeders here at K-State to transfer these gene-editing advances to the top varieties grown in Kansas, as well as other U.S. breeding programs.
One of the goals in our project is to transfer gene editing events into top varieties that already grow in the fields here in Kansas or in the United States. We take these varieties and we cross them with the plants that express CRISPR-Cas9 constructs, and we already demonstrated that certain changes in the genome that we induce with CRISPR-Cas9 already have positive effect on the yield component traits, like they increase the seed size, they increase the number of seeds per spike, and so on. And after crosses are done, in the progeny of these crosses, now we start looking for plants that correspond to these varieties. They are close genetically to the varieties that we want to modify, that also these plants carry the gene editing events that we wanted to transfer, and plus they do not have CRISPR-Cas9 constructs expressed in these plants. And these plants essentially will be tested later on in the field conditions, and in addition to the traits that already bred into these varieties by many years of breeders' efforts, we now quickly transfer new gene editing events, and hopefully we can improve yield and other traits.
Once more, nothing new is added to the resulting wheat variety, only an improvement in the performance of the wheat's genes. And again, it's about time efficiency. By using the CRISPR-Cas9 technology, all of this can be achieved in a single wheat line within a mere couple of years.
Usually, I would say that we would save if a normal breeding process, if you use traditional marker-assisted selection or other more classical breeding techniques, it would take from 6 to 10 years to transfer any trait into new varieties. Whereas with the CRISPR-Cas9, these steps can be accomplished within 2 years. So here we are talking about 3 to 5-fold acceleration in the rate of transfer of new changes into new varieties.
And potentially, says Edward, this gene editing technology could eventually lead to new traits introduced into wheat.
It can induce some changes in the genome or in the genes that can bring new traits and induce some changes that are not possible by using traditional breeding approaches. Usually traditional breeding involves screening existing germplasm for genetic variation that is useful, and then using this genetic variation to improve the trait. And if the specific genetic variation that would beneficially affect the trait is not present at all in the screened germplasm, you cannot do anything with that. Whereas CRISPR-Cas9 can use the knowledge of the gene biology to introduce change in any part of the genome and modify any gene, and then these can bring essentially new traits, and then that are much better than those that currently exist in the germplasm collections. Like, for example, by knowing the biology of interaction between the host and pathogen, you can identify genes that are used by the pathogen to invade the plant and that are critical for pathogen to induce disease. And then using CRISPR-Cas9 technology, you can modify these genes so that they are not recognizable anymore by the pathogen, and then produce resistant variety. However, it is possible that these kind of changes that you would induce using CRISPR-Cas9 technology, they might not actually exist in the natural populations in the germplasm. So essentially, you are bringing a new targeted, new variation. You can induce new variation in a targeted way by using your knowledge about the biology of the process.
Call it a significant step forward in wheat variety improvement. Through the employment of this gene editing technology, researchers here at K-State are fully putting it to work now, including Eduard Akhunov, who is a wheat geneticist in the plant pathology department here at K-State. As Edward mentioned earlier, this project is being funded by the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative Competitive Grant Program out of the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. We've Mike Side now, a new guest to the program, but he's been on the faculty of the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University for a few years. And his special interest is in agribusiness and food supply chain issues. Keith Harris is with us. Keith, welcome, first of all, our first chance to visit with you. So thank you for coming over.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
A bit more on your background. You spent not a little bit of time in the industry itself within the food sector, right?
I did. I started off my career as a grain merchandiser, and I worked for a company called General Mills in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And
folks have heard of it.
Folks have heard of it. Yeah, a little company up in Minneapolis. And
right.
I, as a grain merchandiser, really assist into the purchasing of and the merchandising of wheat for Wheaties, for example, or Gold Medal flour, as well as oats for the Cheerios brand and some of the other grain-based snacks, as well as some export programs. So that really got me into this in terms of really learning how that business operates and understanding how merchandising, in that case, how it actually connected with the overall goal and objective of the firm itself. So that spent some time with that firm, and I've also spent times with other firms in the industry as well. So as a result of that, I had some experiences in terms of dealing with grain, dairy, as well as animal proteins, particularly on the pork side of the business.
And then you bring it to academia and share those experiences and your ongoing interest in the mechanics of food systems, or is it beyond that?
It's primarily that, and it's also one of which that, I think that what we often find is that our businesses are not the same 5 years ago, and we would be a bit naive if we didn't think that it will not be the same 5 years in the future from now. So it's a dynamic space that we're always working in. And the food industry is no different from that perspective, whether it's regulations, whether it's markets, whether it's prices, whether it's weather, whether it's consumers and their preferences. All those things tend to change over a period of time. And oftentimes trying to match supply with demand is one of the most challenging things that I think that we're faced with. At least that's what the food chain is faced with, given the fact that those variables, tend to change over a period of time.
When you look at food systems, as we're talking about it in the broad context here, of course, no one system is exactly likened to the other, but are there common denominators to those systems that make them successful?
Oh, that's a good question. I think when I tend to look at, I'll call it the food economy, and the food economy is one of which, as we define, is one of which those are involved on the input side, those that are involved in the processing or production side, those that are involved in wholesaling and retailing of that product. So if we look at those four, we kind of look at it and define it as the food economy. So the question becomes is what are the similarities or the differences between those two? They tend to work sort of synergistically in some cases, or at least they kind of operate as a network to some degree. So the coordination of those are, they're very important. And of course, they all have they all are chartered for their own reasons, right? Each firm within that group and along that chain, they have their responsibilities and what they're charged to do. But at the same time, there has to be some level of participation, collaboration, or at least some level of coordination that goes on so that we can move product from one end to the other in such a coordinated way that everyone benefits. So I would say that the similarity in those is that I think there's always an underlying effort in order to, again, to match supply with demand. And I think that comes down to the issues of profit in many cases that will help them achieve that perfect or somewhat perfect match.
That perfect match, that's what ends up being the difference maker between success and lack of success in the industry. Then it's as simple as that.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And I think, I think that firm that can do that best will find themselves having a competitive advantage, right? And also we're kind of looking at it from a perspective is that, again, we cannot look at it in isolation. We can have one link in that chain, so to speak, or within that food economy. If one link is doing very well and the others aren't, then they're not overall optimizing what they could potentially be, right? They may be benefiting today, but because the other links may not be doing as well, then the whole link in that case sort of suffers, or the economy suffers in that case. But if we're able to lift everyone up to some degree, then that means that you're able to really optimize that economy, if you will, and really lead itself into a competitive advantage.
Keith, part of our purpose in bringing you here today is to share research initiatives that you've undertaken under this umbrella here at Kansas State on two fronts, you say, ongoing currently. One has to do with entry-level people into the industry and their interest in commodity marketing. What's the genesis of that?
When I came to K-State, I noticed that one of our classes, we have a commodities futures class. It is very, very popular. And just kind of curious to me what really interests students to be in part of this career. Considering that I spent my early parts of my career as a grain merchandiser, I kind of have an insight in terms of what this career is and what it entails, but also want to kind of get a feel for what is it that students find attractive about this particular career. So we went through a process of contacting some other grain merchandising companies, if you will, or companies that are heavily involved in grain merchandising, and asked them about the ways that they go about recruiting and retaining sort of like these early career employees. Similar to other firms and other industries, there's a way of recruiting new employees, but it's another issue for the retention, right? And as such, we want to get a feel for what is it that the student willing to pursue? What are the attributes or what are the parts of this particular job in merchandising is it that students are willing to pursue this career? So with that understanding, we were able to come up with a study that we'll distribute it to some students, in general the College of Agriculture, but specifically in the Ag Econ department, for those students that are going in that career, and to ask them some very specific questions that will help us to isolate those attributes of the job that they find to be very interesting and they're willing to pursue a career in merchandising.
And then that information will be used on several fronts, presumably, what you find out?
Absolutely. There's two primary fronts that they'll be used in. One of them is it really will help those in the industry to understand what is valuable from the student's perspective, right? Now, make no bones about it, the job is the job, so to speak, and employers completely understand the part of the job that just makes up the job itself. But at the same time, I think employers also want to know what is it about this job that is attractive to students, right? Is it where they may live in a city environment or a rural environment? Perhaps even the salary could be a part of it. It could be the professional side or the technical skills that they're involved in. Let's call that risk management and analysis type of skills and such. What is their risk preference? Are they more risk averse or are they more risk neutral? Going to these type of things. So with that type of information, I think the employer can perhaps even maybe revise or rethink or say, hey, we're on the right track in terms of how we're using our recruiting program to recruit grain merchandisers in this case. So that's one group that will definitely benefit from it. The other group would be those participants that are part of it, right? So now they can begin to see, by taking the survey in this case, what in fact is important for the employer, right? These are some of the things that make up the job, kind of the core parts that make up the job. And again, this job is not only from a technical perspective, that is, if they understand basis and futures trading and things like that, but it is also with respect to the social aspects of the job, the organization itself, and even their own behaviors, if their behaviors are the type of behavior that would fit in this type of environment. So they'll get a feel for what is expected on this type of job to be successful in it. And also, again, the employer gets a greater insight in terms of what their potential employees feel is attractive to them in this role.
That project ought to render some interesting results for all parties' parts, and we'll see how that goes. Yes. The other initiative that you've undertaken, you're going to be looking at the adoption of technology within the food system and food companies in particular. What's the inspiration here?
Well, it was over the years, there's been a very expensive software that many firms are using. And oftentimes the software is called Enterprise Resource Planning, or it's called ERP is the name of it. But it's a very expensive software. But there's been a lot of adoption of this software. We've been looking at some data starting from 1990 going to 2012 to find those firms within that food economy I mentioned earlier that have, in fact, adopted this software. And, of course, they adopted it at varying times. It was 1995 or 2010 for that matter. But we have about 52 companies on as part of our data set that have adopted this ERP type system. So we're kind of curious to move beyond sort of the anecdotal evidence out there that comes from many firms that says, hey, this is a really good software. It really serves us quite well. So we wanted to look at it from a standpoint of, with this type of investment, what can we expect from the firm in terms of increasing productivity and increasing efficiency from that perspective. So we wanted to see if, in fact, we could see some level of shift that those firms may have experienced by having this software. And we're not by any means making some judgments to saying that this technology is the only reason why they would have either digressed or progressed. But we are saying that we do know that technological advancements or productivity is due to some type of technological advancement, and the purchase of this type of a software very well could have an impact on that.
Well, there's a great deal at stake in regard to the performance and the effectiveness of that software. As you say, this is extraordinarily expensive, this software. So it's not just reputation, but it's money on the table.
Absolutely. We found that in some cases, or many cases, it costs about 3% of a firm's revenue to purchase and implement this type of a software. So it's a pretty sizable and important investment, and we just want to move beyond sort of some of the anecdotal data that we've seen in terms of how it supported performance and its overall performance.
And we wish you well in all of these undertakings, and we'll have you back soon. Appreciate your time.
And I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
He's an agricultural economist at K-State. Once again, his area of expertise in agribusiness and the food supply chain. Keith Harris, and he's been our guest on this part of Agriculture Today. We'll be back in a moment on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
Both magazines have articles of successful ranchers and farmers with their own philosophies.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Both magazines use smooth, glossy paper. Both showed plenty of clear, sharp photographs. Both shared information. Both used environmentally friendly words, such as steward of the land. But one tells me to manage grass like a crop. One is a publication which says protection, conserving, preserving the land. The other, advancing conservation in the Great Plains. The distinction made between growing grass and managing rangeland. I'm not at a loss because I do understand where each publication comes from. The one which reads, "Ready to grow more grass," is a chemical company. It reads further, "Beat brush, one plant at a time." 3 keys to weed control. The other speaks of stewardship of ecosystems in Kansas and the heartland, with emphasis on conservation of birds, wildlife, prairies, and other habitats. Both magazines have articles of successful ranchers and farmers with their own philosophies. If I did not have my own mind, it would be very confusing, as both talk about management of grasslands with production in mind. However, the environmental approach looks at grassland and prairies as an ecosystem and habitat. The one stresses the love for the land passed on from one generation to another with understanding. The other tells you to keep it simple and advises with 3 key steps to weed spraying. I understand that those of us who own grassland need to take care of the grass first, whether it is the Flint Hills or the high plains out west with the short buffalo grass. They are different ecosystems. Understanding the history of either and how the buffalo grazed and traveled is needed. And then there was the fire set by the American Indian or by storms. Oh yes. Then there are water issues, native streams, and more. The aquifer. Different grasses, different ecosystems have different management and grazing needs. And that is what I find fascinating. I don't need to tell you that the management skill with more holistic approach is what I prefer. I'm scared of chemicals. To many of you, I know this sounds ridiculous, but I've lived long enough that I've learned that quick fixes can have far-reaching results which I might not like. Yes, I'm ready to grow more grass. Maybe I mean to say better grass. I do want forbs. I do not want only grass. I know that cattle will convert the grass into weight gain, and that means money in the bank. At least that's what we hope for and work for. We expect and hope for needed moisture to grow the grass, to grow the high-quality native prairie grass we burn. From what I've read and observed, we're still trying to understand and learn more about burning techniques. I have started so-called patch burning with a friend. I hope to live long enough to see the benefit of it in plant composition as well as grazing regime by the cows. I have to tell my neighbors to make sure that if they plan to burn this spring, to control and stop their burn at the fence line. An uncontrolled burn onto my property now can undo our future burning plans. We will control our burn. All I really do not need, is a city neighbor who has land overgrown with tall cedars ordering his crew to throw the match on a windy day, and the fire gets out of control, jumps our fence and is stopped by the county fire department. We burned our first 1/3 last fall. Managing rangeland is a science. To manage grassland, a brome or fescue paddock, is different. I'm not convinced that one needs to use chemicals there either. Yes, mowing or clipping may be needed, but those paddocks I see as being flatland and fenced in neatly. Our rangeland has flat hilltops and steep sides. Managing that topography makes it even more interesting and challenging, and burning properly should help. The first time I walked our rangeland, I had to hold my 2 hands in front of my face to prevent the tall grass from cutting my face. That spring, the grass had not been burned nor grazed the whole year before. No need to tell you that when we did throw the match that spring, we had a roaring, all-consuming fire, and the hills turned black with a mighty roar. I wished I'd taken a few photos, but pictures were not on my mind. controlling and watching that burn was on my mind. All it took were a few lighted matches tossed into the grass, and whoosh! We have never been able to have a similar burn, as we have harvested the range through grazing. Only 1 year we did not run cattle, and I rested the grass. There was no income, but I'm sure it benefited the range. And we had plenty of fuel next year for a good, even burn. But I wonder, who really knows range management? It seems to change from year to year, with all the variables thrown in. I think having an old experienced rancher share his life experience as a rancher would be a great benefit. I'm not knocking researchers. The trouble is they often need to produce results and come up with answers. The other problem I see is that they don't own the land, nor is their income dependent on the year's weight gain of cattle, offset by grass consumed. 2 glossy magazines using similar words. Interesting indeed. You got to sort it out.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on rural Kansas. And that's our time for today. As always, we appreciate you being along with us and welcome you right back here this same time tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.